The first time I saw a fish that didn't move, I thought the crushing depth was finally driving me insane. Its glassy eyes locked on me, body suspended in the black water as though the ocean itself had forgotten gravity. That was when the captain reminded me, there are 11 strange rules we must follow in the Mariana Trench if we want to survive, and the first is the hardest to remember when panic sets in. I broke it once, and what followed still keeps me awake. I'll tell you about the rules, but you'll understand why I can't start with all of them. After all, I'm not even sure what's watching me right now. When I first joined the descent team for the trench survey, I thought most of the rules were just paranoia masked as tradition, warnings passed down by divers too long in the dark. But on my first shift, Captain Nivers leaned close, his voice low enough that only I could hear, and he told me, Rule 1. Never shine your light on a fish that isn't swimming. At the time, I smirked behind my mask and thought he was joking, though the way his hand lingered on my shoulder felt more like a warning than a welcome. We descended past 3,000 meters, the light fading until only the lamps from the submersible painted arcs through the black. I'd seen strange things before in training. Fish with skin like glass, creatures that pulsed with their own faint glow, but nothing compared to the silence of the trench. The water pressed against the hull like the weight of a mountain, and even though the instruments hummed steadily, I felt each groan of the metal in my chest. When something drifted just outside the beam, I leaned forward instinctively, tempted to focus the lamp. At first it looked like any other deep-sea fish, pale and bloated, floating still in the water. My hand moved toward the spotlight controls, but I felt Ivor's stare burning into me. "Don't," he muttered, his voice steady but hard, like he had rehearsed the word 1,000 times. I froze, realizing this was my first test of the rule. The fish didn't move, not even a twitch of fin or eye, and I couldn't shake the thought that the current itself had stopped for it. The hair on my arms prickled beneath the suit. We continued downward, the ghost-like shape vanishing into the dark, as if it had never been there. My heart pounded, half from the pressure, half from the thought of what might have happened if I had swung the light fully onto it. I kept reminding myself it was superstition, a mental safeguard against the madness of isolation. But superstition doesn't make the captain's knuckles white, or cause him to mutter the rules under his breath like a prayer. Even when the fish was gone, I felt its eyes staring at me from behind the black glass. Later that night, docked in the lower chamber of the research rig, the team sat around the narrow mess table, silent except for the hum of generators. One of the younger divers, Harris, broke the quiet with a laugh, asking if we all believed in ghost stories. He said he'd seen the same fish out there and nearly lit it up, just to prove it was nothing but a dead floater. The room shifted cold in that moment, the kind of silence that feels like something listening. Ivor slammed his cup down, his voice tight. "You shine a light on it, and you won't make it back." Harris scoffed, but didn't push further. I lay awake in my bunk afterward, the words rattling in my head. Why would a light matter? Why would stillness be dangerous? In my mind, I replayed the fish, unmoving, as though suspended on invisible strings. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe certain organisms responded to light aggressively, or maybe it was simply a trick of pressure and perspective. But my gut wouldn't let go of the image. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with eyes gleaming from the dark, frozen bodies waiting just outside the reach of light. 2 days later, Harris broke the silence again, this time during a night dive. He claimed he saw one, hanging just beyond the beams, and said he was going to test the captain's warnings. I was in the observation chamber when I saw the faint circle of his personal lamp sweep outward. The voice in my head screamed for him to stop, but the transmission cut out with a static hiss before I could call him back. The rest of the crew scrambled to re-establish contact, but the only thing we heard through the comms was slow, steady breathing that didn't belong to Harris. We pulled him back in minutes later, but he was pale, lips trembling, eyes wide and unfocused. He kept mumbling about how it turned toward him the moment the light touched, that its mouth stretched wider than its body, that the water itself seemed to warp. The med team strapped him down, but he wouldn't stop thrashing. By morning his bunk was empty, restraints unbuckled, and the hatch to the outer chamber unlocked. No one had seen or heard him leave. We searched the surrounding waters for 2 days, but all we found were strange drag marks on the seabed, as though something had pulled itself forward rather than swam. The crew grew restless, whispers circling the rig like unseen currents. Some wanted to turn back, but the mission was funded, timed, and critical. Ivers kept us steady, reminding us of the rules with more urgency than before. His voice cracked once, just for a second, and I knew he had seen this happen before. He never admitted it, but his silence told me enough. Every time I approached the viewport, I half expected to see Harris floating outside, still and waiting. On my next scheduled dive, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The trench was darker than usual, the submersible's beams barely stretching into the void, and then I saw it again. The same pale body, suspended motionless, its eyes reflecting the faintest glimmer of my lamp. My hand hovered over the controls, the urge to illuminate it gnawing at me like an itch under my skin. I remembered Rule 1, never shine your light on a fish that isn't swimming, but the temptation was overwhelming, as though something in the silence dared me to break it. For a moment the fish twitched, not swimming, just a single sharp jerk, unnatural and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I swear the beam dimmed on its own, though the instruments showed no fault. In that flicker of darkness, I saw something far larger, deeper in the void, like dozens of pale shapes frozen in place, all staring back. When the light steadied, only the one remained, closer now, its mouth just barely open. I slammed the controls, pulling the submersible upward, heart hammering against my ribs. The ascent felt slower than ever, and in the glass reflection, for just a second, I thought I saw Harris sitting in the co-pilot's seat, unmoving, eyes blank, and lips curled in a smile that didn't belong to him. When I looked again, the seat was empty, but the cold pressed in tighter than the water ever could. That night, the crew swore they heard someone knocking against the hull from outside, slow and deliberate, like a call waiting to be answered. No one dared look through the portholes. The next morning, none of us spoke of the sound that echoed through the rig, but I saw the fear in their eyes as clearly as I felt it in my chest. Captain Ivers gathered us in the briefing room, and with his voice low but firm, reminded us of Rule 2, never respond to the knocking on the hull. He said the ocean was older than our ships, older than us, and sometimes it wanted us to answer. His words lingered in the stale air, heavier than the pressure outside, and though I wanted to believe it was only drifting debris, I knew the rhythm of those knocks was deliberate. When I lay in my bunk that night, I kept replaying the sound in my mind, slow and patient, like someone tapping with the back of their hand. I pressed the pillow over my ears, trying to block it out, but memory doesn't muffle as easily as sound. Harris's empty bunk across the room felt like an accusation, his absence spreading through the chamber like a disease. I told myself I wouldn't go near the portholes, that I would trust the captain's rules, but curiosity gnawed at me with every passing hour. The next dive was worse. As we descended deeper into the trench, the hull groaned, not from the crushing weight of the sea, but in a way that felt closer, like something was pressing against it from the outside. A faint shudder ran through the submersible, and then it came, 3 dull thuds, measured and spaced like knuckles on steel. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes darting to the viewport, but the captain's hand shot up before I could move. He didn't say a word, just shook his head once, and the message was clear: don't acknowledge it. The thuds came again, louder this time, and though I didn't move, every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. One of the junior engineers, Daniels, muttered under his breath that it had to be Harris, that maybe he was still out there alive. Ivers' glare silenced him, but I saw the conflict in his eyes. The knocking had a cadence too human to dismiss. Daniels gripped the comm switch, as if he might call out, and I swear the moment he touched it, the knocks shifted closer to where he sat. Only when the captain ordered him away did the sound retreat, fading into the deep. Back in the rig, Daniels wouldn't let it go. Over dinner, he whispered about rescue, about how cruel it was to leave someone outside in the dark, and though the others told him to shut up, I saw the doubt spreading. If Harris had somehow survived, would we really leave him? The rules said yes, but rules are hard to follow when guilt gnaws at you. That night, as the generators hummed low, I woke to the faint metallic echo again. Not against the rig this time, but against the hatch to the dive chamber. My heart froze as I realized the sound was inside with us. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I watched the hatch handle tremble slightly, though no one touched it. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scrape that dragged along the steel. I thought of Rule 2, never respond to the knocking on the hull, repeating it silently in my head like a prayer. Minutes passed like hours until the sound faded, leaving only silence thick enough to choke on. In the morning, I convinced myself it was exhaustion playing tricks, but deep down I knew better. 2 days later, Daniels broke. He was on hull inspection duty when the sound came again, this time in front of half the crew. He shouted Harris's name and slammed his palm against the steel in answer before anyone could stop him. The response was immediate, a flurry of knocks, too fast, too eager, rattling the entire rig like something enormous had wrapped its hands around us. Alarms wailed as the structure shook, dust and salt falling from the beams overhead. Ivers pulled Daniels back, screaming for silence, but it was too late. The ocean had heard us. When the chaos settled, we realized a section of the outer corridor was flooded, the pressure doors sealed tight to keep the rest of the rig intact. Daniels stared at the closed passage with hollow eyes, swearing he saw movement in the water before it rushed in. He claimed Harris was out there, his face pale against the glass, knocking with both fists as the sea swallowed him whole. The captain locked him in the med bay after that, but I could still hear Daniels at night, whispering through the vents, begging someone to answer the next time it came. I avoided the portholes for days, but avoidance doesn't stop sound. The knocks returned, sometimes soft, sometimes violent, always patient. Once, I swore I heard my name in the spaces between, as though the ocean itself had learned how to mimic a voice. The others heard it too, though no one admitted it aloud. We ate in silence, worked in silence, slept in silence, each of us waiting for the next strike of knuckles against steel. The rules were supposed to protect us, but rules don't quiet the echo of your own name. On my last shift that week, I was monitoring the sonar when the pattern appeared. At first I thought it was interference, irregular spikes where none should be, but then the cadence aligned with the knocks, a rhythm too perfect to be chance. The signal pulsed through the water like a heartbeat, growing closer, stronger, until it felt like the ocean itself was pressing against the glass. The comms hissed, and through the static, I heard it clearly, a whisper of my own voice, calling from outside, "Open the door." I tore the headset off, my hands shaking, bile rising in my throat. Ivers saw the panic on my face, but didn't ask. He already knew. That night, I didn't sleep. The knocks didn't come to the hull, but they came to me in dreams, soft at first, then furious, shaking the walls of my mind. I woke to silence, but the silence was worse. It felt like the ocean was holding its breath, waiting for me to be the one who broke the rule. When I finally worked up the courage to walk the corridor alone, the steel felt thinner beneath my fingertips, the pressure stronger, as though something was pressing from the other side. Halfway down, I heard it again, slow and steady, just inches away from where I stood. My name, whispered through the metal. This time though, it didn't stop when I froze. It grew louder, clearer, until it felt like someone was right behind me. I turned, heart hammering, certain I would see Harris's pale face staring back, but the corridor was empty. And then the lights went out. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. My instincts screamed to run, but I remembered Captain Ivers' warning before we'd even left port. Rule 3. Never enter a corridor if the lights go out. He told me once that the trench has a way of bending the rig itself, twisting space into something that doesn't belong to us. I stood frozen, pressing my hand against the steel wall, knowing that one wrong step could put me somewhere I'd never come back from. I forced myself to breathe slowly, shallow and controlled, counting each exhale to keep from panicking. The dark felt alive, pulsing against me, and though the corridor stretched only a dozen meters, it now seemed endless. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, but I refused to turn, certain that if I acknowledged them, I'd never stop seeing what followed. My only choice was to wait, no matter how much every nerve screamed at me to flee. The silence pressed tighter, until finally the emergency lamps flickered back to life in a dull red glow. The corridor looked the same as before, but I knew it wasn't. Something subtle had shifted, a faint distortion at the edges of the walls, like ripples frozen mid-motion. I staggered backward, desperate to reach the main chamber, but when I turned, the corridor behind me seemed longer, stretched, as though it had doubled in size. My pulse pounded in my ears, each step heavier than the last, until at last I stumbled into the light of the main bay. I fell against the hatch, gasping, my legs trembling with the effort of standing. Captain Ivers found me there minutes later, pale and drenched in sweat. He didn't ask what I saw. He only nodded, like a man who had been there before. "That's why we don't walk in the dark," he muttered, guiding me back to the mess. His grip was strong, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, yes, but also guilt, as though he'd once broken this rule himself. I didn't ask. Some answers feel more dangerous than silence. The others noticed how shaken I was, and Daniels, still confined to the med bay but always listening, shouted through the vents that the rules were just a cage. He said the ocean didn't want to kill us, only to show us something greater, and that I was too weak to see it. His laughter carried down the hall, echoing in the dim light, and I pressed my hands to my ears until it faded. I tried to convince myself he was losing his mind, but his words burrowed deep, gnawing at my thoughts like rust on steel. That night, I dreamed of the corridor. Only it wasn't the one I knew. The walls were slick with moisture, pulsing faintly as though alive. The lights above buzzed and flared, then blinked out one by one, leaving me in perfect darkness. I heard my own breathing echo back at me, but slower, deeper, as though someone else wore my lungs. When I woke, drenched in sweat, the clock read 3 o'clock, and I swore the corridor outside my cabin stretched farther than it had the day before. On the next dive shift, I stayed close to Ivers, unable to shake the feeling of being hunted. The trench loomed around us, blacker than night, the submersible's light slicing through the void. But when we returned to the rig, something was wrong. The main corridor lights were out, replaced only by the thin red glow of the emergency bulbs. Ivers stopped me at the hatch, his voice low and firm. "We wait. We don't move until it comes back." His words were steady, but his eyes never left the dark stretch beyond. We stood there for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the faint groaning of steel. Then faintly came the sound, footsteps, but too many, overlapping, as if an entire crew walked in unison just out of sight. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to step forward, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it began. The lights flickered once, twice, and then surged back to life in their pale white glow. The corridor was empty. Ivers gave no order to move, only turned sharply and let us through without a word. Later, over dinner, one of the technicians swore he had seen someone in the dark. Harris, standing perfectly still, his face pale, and lips twisted into that same unnatural smile. The others told him to shut up, but I knew better than to doubt him. Harris was gone, yes, but that didn't mean he wasn't waiting for us somewhere. When I closed my eyes that night, I saw him standing in the darkened corridor, motionless, waiting for me to step inside. The next incident wasn't mine. It was Marlowe, another diver, who broke the rule. During a storm on the surface, The generators failed, and the corridors plunged into blackness. Against the captain's orders, Marlowe panicked and bolted down the hall. We heard his shouts over the intercom, distorted by static, cut short by a sound that wasn't human. When the lights returned, Marlowe was gone. His gear was still in the storage room, his bunk untouched, but his voice lingered in the vents for days after, whispering fragments of words none of us wanted to hear. Each time the lights flickered after that, my chest tightened and my feet rooted to the ground. I learned to wait, no matter how long, no matter what sounds came from the dark. The rules weren't superstition, they were survival, but survival felt less certain with each passing day. I started to notice the corridors growing longer, the walls bending subtly, the angles no longer true. Sometimes I thought I saw faces in the reflection of the steel, watching me from the corners of my vision, always gone when I turned. One night, I woke to find my cabin door slightly open, though I always locked it. The corridor beyond was dark, not a flicker of light in sight. My throat went dry as I stared into the void, certain I saw movement, slow, deliberate, just past the frame. My instincts screamed to shut the door, to lock it, to stay inside, but my legs betrayed me. I found myself stepping closer, the blackness pulling at me like a tide, and then just as my foot crossed the threshold, a hand, warm, human, desperate, seized my wrist and yanked me back. I collapsed onto the floor as the lights blazed suddenly back to life, revealing nothing but an empty corridor stretching endlessly forward. Captain Ivers stood over me, pale and shaking, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen before. He whispered, almost to himself, "That wasn't supposed to happen." Captain Ivers' grip didn't loosen for a long moment, his knuckles white against my wrist, as though letting go meant losing me to something I couldn't see. He didn't explain what he had pulled me away from, but his eyes darted toward the steel walls, as if they could betray us at any second. That night, before I finally collapsed into a restless sleep, he came to my cabin and whispered the next law of survival into the dim light. Rule 4. If you hear knocking from outside the hall, do not answer it. He didn't wait for questions. He only said, "It won't be what you think it is." At first, I thought it was another of his strange rituals, a superstition born from years in the trench, but I learned how wrong I was the very next evening. The storm above had worsened, rattling the rig until the pipes shook and the vents groaned like they might burst. The sound masked everything, until suddenly, in the lull between waves, I heard it, a steady rhythm against the outer hull, deliberate and calm, as though someone stood in the dark water knocking politely to be let inside. I froze, certain I was imagining it, but then Daniels, still confined to the medbay, shouted down the hall, "They're here, they've come for us." The crew rushed to seal off every hatch, their movements frantic but silent, as if making noise might encourage the knocking to grow louder. Ivers barked at me to stand still, his voice sharp with a command that left no room for doubt. "Don't respond, don't even breathe too loud," he hissed. My mind rebelled at the thought. What if it was another rig? What if someone had survived out there and needed us? But the knocking continued, calm and patient, not the desperate banging of a drowning man, but the confident rhythm of something that knew exactly what it wanted. Hours passed like that, with the sound moving slowly along the hull, pausing at intervals, almost as though it was listening. I pressed my ear to the wall once, against Ivers' orders, and the cold bit through my skin like ice. Behind the steel, I didn't hear water. I heard breathing, long deep breaths, exhaling in perfect time with my own, until I jerked back, trembling. Ivers didn't need to scold me. The look in his eyes was enough, a warning carved into his face by years of obeying rules that weren't meant to be broken. When the sound finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. The crew relaxed in fragments, shoulders slumping, hands loosening on tools they had clutched like weapons. But Daniels wasn't done. From the medbay, his voice carried through the vents, taunting us, telling us the knocks were invitations, that they were offering us freedom from the suffocating steel coffin we lived in. "You're cowards," he sneered, his laughter echoing far too long, as though carried by more than just his throat. Ivers ordered him silenced, but no one dared go near his door. The next night, I learned why. I woke to the sound again, softer this time, almost playful. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more, each one precise and measured. I sat up in my bunk, staring at the wall, and for an instant I swore I saw the steel dent inward with each knock, as though the hall itself was only paper to whatever stood outside. I told myself not to answer, not to acknowledge it, but when the knocks shifted to the rhythm of my own heartbeat, I found myself whispering, "Who's there?" The moment the words left my lips, silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I didn't sleep after that. The fear that I had already broken the rule ate at me, each hour dragging by in the glow of the emergency light. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing, but the truth found me in the mess hall. The others avoided my eyes, their whispers carrying just far enough for me to hear. They knew the knocks had stopped the moment I spoke. Ivers said nothing, but the disappointment in his silence was worse than any reprimand. For the rest of that day, the air in the rig felt different, heavier, as though something had followed me back inside. 2 days later, we lost another man. Bennett was on watch in the control room when the storm quieted and the knocking began again, louder, sharper. He was brave, maybe too brave, and against orders he pressed the external comms button, trying to reach whatever was out there. The feed filled with static, a harsh roar that set every tooth in my skull on edge, and then just beneath it came the sound of his own voice, repeating back to him words he hadn't said. The others found the control room empty, the chairs still spinning, the headset dangling. There was no trace of him. After that, the crew moved like shadows, silent and efficient, every man and woman too afraid to draw attention. We ate in silence, slept in silence, even breathed in silence, all terrified that the knocks would return if we made the wrong sound. Daniels only laughed, his voice always there, reminding us that we couldn't hide forever. He said the trench wanted us, and that knocking was just the beginning. His words burrowed into me, making me question each sound, each vibration through the hull, until I could no longer tell if the knocks were real or only in my head. One night, I dreamed of Bennett. He stood outside the viewport, his face pale, his lips moving, though no sound reached me. His hands pressed gently against the glass, tapping in a rhythm I didn't recognize. Behind him, shadows moved, too large to be fish, too quick to be machines. I woke choking on air, the taste of salt water heavy in my lungs, and when I stumbled to the sink, I swore I saw condensation on the mirror, 3 faint handprints, dripping as though they had just been pressed there. The next evening, the knocking came again, louder than ever, echoing through every wall, until it felt like the rig itself was begging us to open. This time, no one moved. We sat in silence, trembling, waiting, as the sound traveled along the corridors, deliberate, searching. It stopped outside my cabin. Each knock shook the frame, slow and patient, until I thought the door might splinter. And then from inside the hall, I heard my own voice whispering, "Let me in." When I heard my own voice outside the cabin door, the air in my lungs froze solid. It was faint, muffled by the steel, but every inflection was perfect. The same rasp, the same nervous stutter I'd had since childhood. I couldn't bring myself to move, too aware of the rule I had been warned about the day before. Rule 5. Never trust a voice that sounds like your own. Captain Ivers had whispered it to me like a curse, and now I understood why his eyes had looked so hollow when he said it. He knew this moment would come for me. The voice didn't stop. It begged in soft tones, insisting it was me, trapped outside in the water, desperate to get back in. The sound rattled my thoughts, peeling away reason until I started to doubt the memory of who I was. Was I the one inside, trembling in the dark, or the one outside, drowning just beyond the hull? I pressed my palms over my ears, but it didn't matter. The words bled straight into my skull, bypassing the need for sound at all. It was inside my head, urging me to open the hatch, telling me that I didn't belong here. Anvers appeared at my door before I could do something reckless. His hand clamped over my mouth, eyes burning with warning. "Don't speak to it," he whispered, so close I could feel the weight of his breath. He didn't explain further, but I saw the terror etched into the grooves of his face. He motioned for me to follow him back to the central hub, and we walked in silence while the voice followed behind us. Every word it spoke sounding like my own thoughts, made flesh. By the time we reached the others, my knees were shaking so hard I could barely stand. The crew avoided me that night. No one would meet my eyes, not even Daniels, whose taunts had grown strangely quiet after the knocking. They all knew what I had heard. I caught fragments of their whispers, things about the mimic, and how it chooses who to follow. No one dared say the rule aloud, as if speaking it might invite the thing closer, but I saw the truth in their haunted stares. It had singled me out, and now every moment felt like a test I was doomed to fail. Sleep became impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of corridors flooded with black water, of a second me standing at the far end, motionless, waiting. The dreams bled into waking life until I could no longer separate them. Once in the mess hall, I caught sight of myself sitting at a table, staring at me with a dead smile. I blinked, and the image was gone, but the spoon in my hand had bent as though squeezed too tightly by someone else's grip. I didn't tell the others. I was afraid they'd stop treating me as one of them. The voice grew bolder with each passing night. It no longer lingered only at my door, but followed me in the vents, the plumbing, even in the faint static of the comm system. Sometimes it whispered in sync with my thoughts, tricking me into thinking I was only talking to myself, until the words turned cruel, mocking me for my fear. Once when I shouted at it to shut up, Daniels burst into laughter from the med bay, yelling, "He's talking to himself now, just like I said he would." The others glared at me, their suspicion heavier than the trench itself. I tried everything to drown it out, stuffing cloth into my ears, keeping music running on the few tapes we had, even reciting navigation charts aloud until my throat ached. But no matter how loud I made the world, the voice always seeped through, patient and unrelenting. One evening, while I was on equipment duty, it asked me a question in my own voice. "Do you remember which side you're really on?" My hand slipped, wrench clattering to the floor, and when I bent to pick it up, I caught a reflection in the oil sheen on the metal. It wasn't my face. The reflection smiled at me, even though I wasn't smiling. Its lips moved with words I hadn't spoken, but I understood them anyway. "You can't ignore me forever." I staggered back, slamming into the wall, and when the others came to check on the noise, the reflection was gone. Still, Ivers knew. He didn't need proof. He just pulled me aside and muttered, "Hold on as long as you can. It will keep trying." His words felt like a death sentence. Not advice, not encouragement, just an acknowledgement that I was already marked. On the fifth night, the mimic tried a new tactic. I woke to find the cabin door cracked open, though I had locked it myself. Beyond the gap stood a shadow with my exact height and build, its silhouette perfect against the dim emergency lights. It whispered my name in my own voice, urging me to step closer, promising that everything would make sense if I just listened. For a moment I nearly obeyed. Something deep inside me longed to merge with it, to become whole again, as if I had been living incomplete my entire life. But then I remembered the rule, and I slammed the door shut with every ounce of strength I had left. The next morning, the crew found a smear of wet footprints leading away from my door, vanishing halfway down the corridor. I didn't try to explain. Their looks said enough. They already believed I was compromised. Daniels only laughed, calling me half of a man now, his voice breaking into static that didn't sound fully human anymore. Ivers told me to stick close to him, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his gaze. The mimic had marked me, and that meant it was only a matter of time before I slipped. That evening, During inspection rounds, I heard the voice again, not outside, but inside the control room. It was standing in the shadows, waiting for me, its form half-formed but growing sharper with every second I hesitated. This time, it didn't beg or taunt, it only smiled and said, "We're running out of time." My knees buckled, my vision swam, and I realized with a sick certainty that it was right. Something was changing in the trench, something bigger than the mimic, and soon it wouldn't matter whether I trusted the voice or not. The mimic's words haunted me, looping through my thoughts until they became my own. By the time I dragged myself into the mess hall the next day, every eye on me felt like a blade. Ivers stood at the head of the table, hollow-eyed but unshaken, and as the crew murmured about strange readings in the outer cameras, he recited the next truth we were forced to live by. Rule 6. Never follow a light that appears outside the rig. He said it like a prayer, firm and absolute, and for the first time, I wished he hadn't told me what the rule was. That night, as if the trench itself wanted to test my resolve, the first light appeared. It flickered against the observation window, faint at first, like the glow of a single lantern drifting lazily in the dark. I pressed my forehead to the glass, breath fogging the surface, and for a moment it looked like salvation, a flare from another vessel, a signal from someone alive out there. But Ivers grabbed my shoulder before I could lean closer, his grip iron strong. "Don't look too long," he hissed, dragging me back. His face was pale, more afraid than when he had warned me about the voice. The light pulsed brighter, changing colors like some deep-sea creature, showing off impossible patterns. It moved slowly, teasingly, drifting just beyond reach. Every rational thought screamed that it was a rescue beacon, a sign of hope in the crushing dark. Yet there was something hypnotic about its rhythm, too smooth, too calculated. The longer I stared, the more my chest ached, as if the light were tugging at my heartbeat itself, pulling me forward. I looked away only when I felt my knees bend on their own, my body ready to walk straight into the abyss if I let it. Ivers wasn't the only one who noticed. Two of the younger crewmen argued in whispers, one swearing it had to be a distress call, the other shaking his head violently, repeating the rule under his breath, as though it would save him. They were still arguing when the comms unit crackled alive with a faint SOS signal. Static filled the room. Then a voice, human, desperate, begging for help, coordinates flashing that matched the position of the drifting light. My stomach churned. How could a rule forbid us from answering that? Could I really ignore another human being in need? Daniels laughed through the vent, his voice gleeful. "Go to them. Save them. They're waiting for you." His mocking tone only deepened the rift in my mind. Ivers slammed the comms off, eyes blazing, but I could see the doubt flickering in the faces around the table. Were we supposed to abandon someone calling for help just because of superstition? The question gnawed at me until sleep became impossible. I lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the rig, and each time I closed my eyes, I saw the light pulsing outside, waiting, inviting. On the third night, one of the crew broke. Simmons slipped out of his bunk during the dead hours, drawn by the glow that had returned to the starboard side. I woke to the hiss of the outer hatch ceiling and sprinted with Ivers to the observation deck. Through the glass, I saw Simmons' suit light merge with the glow outside, his silhouette dissolving into the radiance, until there was nothing left but the pulse of color. The comms picked up a single scream, distorted and metallic, before cutting off. The light blinked once more, then vanished into the trench. The aftermath was worse than the loss itself. No one spoke Simmons' name again, but we all felt his absence like a missing limb. Meals went untouched, conversations died mid-sentence, and every shift in the shadows felt like his ghost drifting just beyond the glass. Ivers doubled the watch rotations, forbidding anyone from stepping near the observation ports without supervision, but the lights kept coming back. Some nights there was one, sometimes two, and once I counted 7 drifting in a slow circle around us, like predators waiting for weakness. Their glow seeped through the steel walls, staining the corridors in eerie hues that left no corner untouched. One evening, I caught myself reaching for the hatch lever without realizing it. My hand hovered inches away, trembling, as the light outside pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat again. Ivers yanked me back so hard I thought my arm would break, his face twisted with fury and fear. "That's how it starts," he spat, shoving me away from the hatch. "First you think you're in control, then you're gone." His words echoed in my skull long after he stormed off, and I realized with horror that he was right. The rule wasn't about superstition, it was about survival against something that knew exactly how to lure us out. By the fifth night, Daniels had stopped mocking us and started chanting. His voice spilled through the vents, repeating in perfect time with the lights outside, his tone hollow and unearthly. It wasn't Daniels anymore, or at least, not just him. Sometimes the words overlapped, like more than one voice speaking through his throat, urging us to step outside, to see the truth. The lights responded, flaring brighter each time he spoke. The air in the rig grew hot, oppressive, as though the very pressure outside had seeped in to suffocate us. I thought of the trench not as a place anymore, but as a living thing, patient and hungry. Then came the night of the blackout. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, and went out, plunging the rig into suffocating darkness. The hum of the generators died, replaced by an unnatural silence. When the cameras rebooted seconds later, every monitor showed the same thing: hundreds of lights outside, arranged in spirals, moving in patterns no machine could design. They pulsed together, a single heartbeat, and though no sound came through, I swore I could hear a chorus of voices whispering, calling my name. The mimic's warning echoed in my head: "We're running out of time." Ivers barked orders, trying to restore power, but my eyes were glued to the viewport. The largest of the lights had drifted close, impossibly close, pressing against the glass until it filled the entire frame. For a split second, I saw something inside it, a face, human but stretched, its mouth open in a scream that never ended. And then the glass groaned, the sound of metal straining under a force it was never meant to withstand. The crew scattered, panic breaking the fragile order, and in that chaos I realized the lights weren't just outside anymore, they were inside with us. The blackout stretched on longer than it should have, shadows flickering as if they had weight of their own. The hum of the generators crawled back slowly, a weak heartbeat trying to restart after being silenced. Ivers forced us into a tight group, his voice low but firm as he told us the next truth, one that made the air feel colder than the ocean outside. Rule 7. If you find a door open that you know is locked, do not go near it. He looked directly at me as he said it, as though the rule was meant for me alone. It didn't take long for the rule to be tested. When the lights returned fully, the first thing I noticed was the hatch to the auxiliary lab standing ajar. I had checked it myself the night before, spinning the wheel until it clanked into place, sealed tight. Now it hung open like a gaping mouth. The corridor beyond swallowed in darkness. The crew froze at the sight, each of us pretending we hadn't seen it, as though looking away would erase it. But the air that drifted from that opening was wrong. Heavier, colder, smelling faintly of brine, despite being deep inside the rig. Ivers snapped at us to keep moving, barking for the hatch to be ignored. But something about the sight rooted me to the spot. The shadows inside the auxiliary lab seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with my chest. My name whispered through the darkness, faint but unmistakable, and I nearly stepped forward before Torres grabbed my sleeve. His voice was a hiss, sharp with terror. "Don't, that's not for us." The way he looked at the hatch made my skin crawl. He wasn't just afraid, he was reverent, as if he was staring at something sacred and forbidden. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the open hatch. I dreamed of walking toward it, bare feet slapping on the wet steel, the darkness pulling at me like a tide. Inside the lab, I saw silhouettes swaying gently, suspended in black water where there should have been air. Their faces were indistinct, blurred like smudged reflections, but their hands reached out for me, their fingers bending wrong, curling like hooks. I woke drenched in sweat, the smell of salt water clinging to my nose, and when I stumbled into the corridor for air, I found the auxiliary hatch sealed tight again. The others pretended nothing had happened, but I caught them glancing at me more often, suspicion sharp in their eyes. Daniels hadn't spoken since the blackout, but I heard his laughter echoing faintly from the vents whenever I walked past that part of the rig. Once I pressed my ear to the steel and swore I heard more than laughter. I heard doors opening and closing, all in places they shouldn't be. When I pulled back, the wheel of the hatch I had just walked past began to spin on its own, grinding against the lock. I sprinted away before I could see if it opened fully. 2 days later, we lost Torres. His shift had been to patrol the lower levels, checking for damage from the blackout. He never returned. We found his tool bag lying just outside the auxiliary hatch, its contents scattered like he had dropped them in a hurry. The hatch itself stood open again, the same breath of cold, briny air drifting through. Ivers ordered it sealed without looking inside, but I caught sight of something before the wheel locked back in place. A single wet handprint on the floor, smaller than Torres, leading into the dark. We never saw him again. From then on, the rig felt different. Doors we swore we had sealed would be found ajar during rotations. Hatches groaned in the night, as though tested from the other side. The locks themselves grew unreliable, sometimes refusing to budge until 2 or 3 of us worked together, our arms shaking with effort. Ivers demanded double checks, but even then the doors betrayed us. It was as if the rig itself wanted to open, to let something inside, or maybe to let something out. The line between inside and outside blurred more with each passing day, and none of us knew which side was safer anymore. One evening, I found myself alone in the corridor leading to the med bay. Daniel's voice was louder than usual, taunting me, promising he knew what lay beyond the auxiliary hatch. As I passed, I noticed his door standing wide open. My stomach lurched. I had locked it myself only hours earlier. Inside, the room was pitch black, the bed empty, the restraints torn loose. The laughter came not from inside the room, but from deeper within, beckoning me closer. My feet inched forward before I remembered the rule, my pulse spiking as I slammed the door shut and spun the wheel until my palms bled. That night, the crew heard knocking again, but this time it came from inside the rig. The sound traveled from door to door, moving through the corridors as though searching for the one foolish enough to answer. I lay awake in my bunk, counting each knock, praying it wouldn't stop outside my cabin. When silence finally fell, I drifted into uneasy sleep, only to wake with my door cracked open an inch, though I had locked it with my own hands. A faint light bled through the gap, shifting like water, and I knew with sick certainty that if I looked too long, I'd see myself standing on the other side. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't stay here much longer. The rules were holding us together, but barely, and each new breach chipped away at what little sanity we had left. Ivers tried to reassure me, tried to tell me that following the rules was enough, but even he couldn't hide the exhaustion in his face. The doors weren't just opening, they were inviting us, daring us to step through, and deep down, I feared the day would come when one of us couldn't resist. That day came sooner than expected. On my next patrol, I turned a corner and saw the cargo bay hatch wide open. Inside, water glistened on the floor, pooling into shapes that shifted when I blinked. A shadow moved at the far end, slow and deliberate, and though I couldn't make out details, I knew exactly who it was. Torres stood there, dripping, his eyes vacant, his mouth stretching into a smile too wide for his face. He lifted a hand, beckoning me forward, and in the silence, I heard my own voice whisper from the darkness, "You forgot to lock the door." Torres' dripping figure haunted me long after the cargo bay hatch was sealed again. I tried convincing myself it was only a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by too many nights without sleep. But the memory of his pale eyes and the way his mouth moved in silence wouldn't let me rest. That's when Ivers finally told me the next warning, his tone grim enough to strip away any illusion of safety we still had. Rule 8. Never trust a reflection after midnight. His voice cracked when he said it, as if he knew too well what came from ignoring it. At first I thought it couldn't be that serious. Reflection seemed harmless compared to open hatches or voices in the vents. But midnight came quickly in that endless dark, and the rig's polished steel walls left plenty of surfaces to catch our faces. That night I caught mine staring back at me longer than it should have, my head turning a fraction too late compared to my own movement. The sight was subtle but enough to freeze my blood. My reflection smiled before I did, a thin, knowing smile that had nothing to do with me. I tore myself away, heart pounding, and avoided every reflective surface I could. Others weren't so careful. Daniels, who had already begun unraveling, spent hours standing in front of a porthole window. I passed by and saw him pressed against the glass, whispering to his own reflection, as if it were giving him instructions. His lips moved in quiet conversation, but the voice I heard didn't match the shape of his words. It was deeper, slower, stretched like it had traveled too far underwater before reaching my ears. When I pulled him back, his reflection lingered behind, grinning with teeth far sharper than his own. The worst came 2 nights later. The blackout alarms had just ended, and I was heading to the galley when I heard shouts. Rushing in, I found 2 crew members fighting near the sink, one swearing the other had attacked him. But the truth was worse. The one being accused insisted he had been alone, washing his face, when his reflection grabbed him by the throat and shoved him forward. His skin bore the red marks of fingers, but no one had touched him. We drained the sink dry, leaving the metal dull, but all of us avoided it after that, terrified of what might look back. Sleep became harder with each passing night, and exhaustion only made the reflections bolder. I started covering the small mirror above my bunk, but sometimes when I lifted the cloth, it had already slipped off. One night, half dreaming, I saw myself sitting upright in bed, grinning, even though I was still lying down. The figure leaned close, its lips brushing against the glass, and I heard the faintest whisper slip into my ears. "You don't belong to yourself anymore." I threw the mirror across the room and shattered it, but when I looked down, the fragments still moved, showing me from angles that didn't exist. Ivers gathered us the next morning, his face gaunt, eyes rimmed red. He warned us to avoid water surfaces, metal polished too clean, even glass. Anything that could give us back our faces was a doorway, he said, and not one we should open. I didn't understand what he meant until I caught Daniels again in the corridor, talking to his reflection in the porthole. Only this time, his reflection didn't mimic him at all. It pressed its hands against the glass, its mouth stretching open, and I swore water began to seep from its lips, flooding the inside of the window. Daniels reached for it like he wanted to drown. We restrained him, locking him in his cabin, but even then the problem didn't stop. His laughter returned, echoing from behind the locked door, and sometimes his voice came from places where no glass or steel should have been. It was as if his reflection had escaped, moving freely, wearing his voice like a mask. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many reflective surfaces were in the rig. Even the smallest bolt of polished steel could catch a sliver of my face. I started avoiding my own eyes whenever I caught glimpses of myself, afraid of what they'd show. By the end of that week, I was certain something had replaced Daniels entirely. When we brought him food, he didn't look at us. He looked past us, grinning at the warped steel wall behind. He whispered something I couldn't hear, and when I risked glancing at the metal, I saw my own reflection instead of his. But my reflection wasn't afraid. It smiled wider than I could, its teeth pale and endless, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I ran from the room, but the sound of that grin followed me in silence, like a scream that never reached my ears. I tried begging Ivers to leave, to abandon the rig before it consumed us, but he only shook his head. "There's nowhere to go," he said quietly. "We're too deep, and the rules are the only thing keeping us here. Break them, and we'll be nothing but echoes." His words rang in my ears, but even then I could see his reflection in the mess hall window, nodding just a second out of sync with him. and when I looked closer, I realized the reflection's mouth wasn't moving at all. Something else behind the glass was pulling its strings. That night, I woke to the sound of water dripping in my cabin. When I looked around, the floor was dry, but the small shard of broken mirror I'd forgotten about glistened with droplets. My reflection leaned close, lips moving in silence, and then I heard it from inside my skull. "Midnight is over. Come closer." My body moved against my will, drawn toward the shard, my hand trembling inches above it. Just before my fingers touched the glass, someone pounded on my door, snapping me free. I never found out who it was, because when I opened the door, the corridor was empty. By then, the rule had burned itself into me. Midnight wasn't just a time on the clock anymore. It was a threshold, a moment where the rig and whatever lived in its shadows overlapped. If we slipped, if we trusted what we saw in those hours, we would stop being ourselves. I began to wonder how many of us already had. And as I passed the auxiliary hatch again on patrol, the steel caught my face in its dull shine. But the reflection staring back wasn't tired like me. It was awake, smiling, and behind it, Torres stood with his hand resting on my shoulder. The reflection of Torres behind me didn't fade, even after I blinked. His hand rested on my shoulder in the glass, while the real corridor remained empty. I turned away, heart pounding, and pressed forward, refusing to look again. That was when I heard the first low thud inside the bulkhead, muffled and deliberate. Ivers had warned us before, but he never said it outright until that night. Rule 9. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, never answer it. He looked pale as he spoke, like even saying it risked drawing attention. At first, I thought it might have been stress creaks from the metal, the kind of groaning sound rigs always made under pressure. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that this wasn't mechanical. The knocks came in patterns, sometimes in slow groups of 3, sometimes in fast raps, like impatient fingers. I pressed my ear close once, and instantly regretted it. On the other side of the steel, I didn't hear echoes or shifting currents. I heard breathing, wet and steady, as though something was pressing its mouth against the wall, waiting for me to reply. Daniels was the first who broke. Locked away in his cabin, he started responding to the knocks with his own fists. At first, the sounds were faint, and the crew ignored them, but they grew louder with each passing night. One evening, his shouts cut through the corridor, claiming that Torres was calling him, asking for help. The knocks answered him in sync, the rhythm unmistakably human, almost conversational. By the time we forced the door open, he was gone. The porthole was sealed, no water inside, but his bed was soaked, as though he'd been dragged straight through the floor. After that, the knocks spread. I heard them near the galley one night, the sound crawling from one wall to the next, tracing me as I walked. Sometimes they came from above, in the ventilation shafts, even though no one could fit inside. Other times they echoed from the reinforced doors to the sea, each hit reverberating like a warning. I wanted to shout, to demand they stop, but the rule hammered itself into my brain. Don't answer, don't acknowledge. Whatever was out there fed on recognition, on the simple act of admitting you could hear it. Ivers told us the worst story while we huddled over cold rations. He said years ago, another crew had broken the rule. They heard the knocking, panicked, and pounded back in desperation. Minutes later, the hatches opened one by one, flooding compartments, though no one had touched the controls. When rescue teams finally arrived, the rig was empty, but the walls were dented inward, as if something had been pounding from the inside, trying to escape. He swore we weren't the first to hear those calls, and we wouldn't be the last. My breaking point came during patrol, when the corridor lights flickered and left me in near darkness. The knocks started immediately, a slow rhythm that grew louder with every step. My radio hissed to life with static, but beneath the crackle, I heard my own voice whispering, "Let me in." It was coming from the wall to my left. I backed away, clutching the radio like it might save me, but the whispering grew clearer, repeating words I knew I hadn't said. The knocks turned urgent, matching the beat of my heart, begging me to respond. I nearly caved. My hand hovered over the steel, trembling, and for one awful moment, I thought about knocking back. That was when Ivers rounded the corner, his flashlight catching me mid-motion. He grabbed my wrist and yanked me away, his eyes wide with fury. "Do you want to end up like Daniels?" he hissed, dragging me down the hall. His words cut through my fog, but the knocks followed us, slamming against the walls until my ears rang. They only stopped once we crossed into the mess hall, as if some invisible line had been drawn there. Sleep offered no relief. I dreamed of the walls thinning, of pale hands pushing through the steel, their nails screeching as they clawed toward me. Sometimes I woke to the sound of metal bending, the bolts straining as though something enormous pressed from the other side. No one spoke much anymore. We were all listening, waiting for the next round of knocks. The silence between them felt worse than the noise, a stretched anticipation that promised something was still out there, patient and relentless. The final straw came during a routine systems check. Alone in the engine room, I heard a knock so close it vibrated the wrench in my hand. Then came another, slower, deliberate. I held my breath, praying it would stop, but instead it came again, followed by a faint voice. It was Torres. His tone was weak, pleading, begging me to open the hatch. My stomach turned as I realized the voice was coming from the coolant pipe. Torres had never been near the engine room, and yet his voice echoed there, distorted, dripping with water. I ran before I could think, leaving my tools scattered. When I returned later with Ivers, the room was silent, but the hatch bore fresh dents from the inside. I didn't need him to repeat the rule. I understood now in my bones. Whatever knocked wasn't human. It only wore familiar voices like bait, waiting for one of us to slip. And as I walked the corridor that night, listening to faint tapping drift through the rig, I realized the rhythm wasn't random anymore. It was spelling something, each knock forming letters against the steel. When I finally made sense of the word, my blood ran cold. It was my name. The walls still whispered my name, long after the knocks faded, and I carried that dread with me into every corridor. Avers didn't let me linger. He shoved me toward the crew quarters, muttering the next warning, like it was a prayer he'd said too many times. Rule 10. Never open a door if someone is already standing on the other side. The way his jaw tightened told me this wasn't superstition. It was survival. I thought I understood, but the truth hit me harder than any pressure the trench could conjure. At first glance, the rule seemed absurd. Of course people stood behind doors sometimes, waiting to come through, but here nothing was ever what it seemed. The rig groaned constantly. Shadows stretched too long under the emergency lights, and every door felt heavier than it should, as though something pressed back from the other side. I learned the meaning of the rule. On the fourth night after Daniels vanished, I was making my way toward the storage bay when I froze at the sound of soft breathing, just inches beyond the steel hatch. It wasn't unusual for crew to move around, but something about the stillness unsettled me. The breathing didn't shift or shuffle. No footsteps, no muttered curses, just slow inhalations that scraped like water filling lungs. I reached for the handle, then stopped, remembering the rule. I whispered into the comm, asking if anyone was stationed there. Silence answered me, thick and suffocating. When I finally forced myself to back away, the breathing followed me for several steps, pressed against the other side of the hatch, as if whatever stood there matched me step for step. Later, during our scarce meal, one of the mechanics admitted she hadn't been sleeping. She described seeing silhouettes under her door, their feet casting shadows against the thin crack at the bottom. At first, she assumed it was another crewmate checking on her, but the longer it stayed, unmoving, the more wrong it felt. She waited nearly 2 hours before daring to open it. When she did, the hallway was empty, but the shadow remained a second longer before dissolving into the floor. None of us touched our food after that confession. The worst encounter came during a blackout. Emergency lighting plunged the rig into dim red pulses, and I was sent to check the auxiliary control room. As I approached the heavy hatch, I heard the scrape of fingernails against the metal. My heart pounded as I froze, knowing someone was right on the other side. The handle shifted slightly, though no one inside should have known I was there. Then came a voice, my own, calling softly for help. The sound of myself begging made my skin crawl, and I stumbled backward, refusing to touch the handle. When the lights flickered back to normal, the door stood still, sealed tight. I never told the others what I'd heard, but Avers knew. He gave me a long, unreadable look and muttered that some doors didn't open into rooms anymore. I didn't ask what he meant, because deep down, I understood. This trench didn't just crush steel. It warped space, bent it in ways no one was meant to witness. Sometimes opening a door wasn't letting someone in, it was letting yourself out into someplace else entirely. The mechanic wasn't as lucky. One morning, her bunk was empty, her door ajar. We searched for hours, but found nothing. No blood, no signs of forced entry, only her boots sitting neatly by her bed. The security feed glitched during the night, leaving us blind. The last recording showed her door handle turning slowly, though she was already asleep inside. What entered her room, we never saw. What left was only an empty bed. After that, half the crew refused to sleep near a door without barricading it first. Every shift became a test of nerve. You never knew which door would betray you, which shadow belonged to something else. I started carrying a wrench at all times, though deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. One night, walking the main hall, I spotted movement under a hatch to the hydro bay. 2 bare feet stood motionless, toes pressed to the gap. I held my breath, praying they would move. They didn't. They waited, perfectly still, until the lights dimmed and flickered out. When they returned, the feet were gone, but the damp outline remained on the floor. Ivers warned us to never hesitate. If you sensed someone on the other side, you turned back. No questions, no exceptions, but hesitation was all we had left. Each decision felt like balancing on a knife's edge, every breath reminding me how fragile we'd become. I couldn't shake the feeling that the rig itself was alive, that it wanted us to open the wrong door, and maybe it wasn't wrong at all. Maybe it was the only door we were ever meant to open. That thought plagued me until the night I awoke to the sound of my own voice outside my cabin. It begged, pleaded, sobbed, every word distorted but unmistakably mine. The door rattled as if something leaned against it, desperate to get in. I covered my ears, rocking in my bunk, trying not to hear. The knocks from Rule 9 had been terrible, but this was worse. This was intimate, personal, designed to break me. I nearly cracked, nearly opened it just to silence the sound. By dawn, the noise stopped, but when I gathered the courage to approach, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A handprint smeared across the metal, pressed from the outside, and it was identical to mine. Not similar, identical, down to the scar on my thumb from years ago. I touched it, and the steel was still warm. That was when I realized the truth. Whatever stood behind those doors wasn't trying to enter, it was trying to replace us. The handprint outside my cabin never faded, no matter how many times I scrubbed at the steel. It clung like rust, like something burned into the rig itself. Ivers watched me with a heaviness in his eyes, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. He finally said what none of us wanted to hear. Rule 11. Never look directly at what follows you up. His words left a silence so thick I could feel my pulse in my throat. That was when I knew this was the last barrier between us and whatever waited outside. At first I didn't understand the wording. Follow us up? We weren't surfacing. The rig was bolted deep into the trench, so far down that the idea of rising back to daylight felt like fantasy. But the phrasing burned into me, and the longer I stayed awake at night, the more I began to notice shapes moving where there shouldn't be any. Sometimes in the corners of reflective glass, sometimes just beyond the reach of the emergency lights, always trailing, always keeping distance, as if waiting for me to look directly at it. The first real glimpse came during a systems check. I was in the main shaft when I heard footsteps echoing just behind mine. They matched me perfectly. Every pause, every quick step when I sped up, When I turned, the hall was empty, but the feeling of being watched dug claws into my spine. That night, while lying in my bunk, I saw a silhouette on the ceiling above me. Its head tilted slowly as I froze, pretending to sleep. When I finally blinked, it was gone, but my sheets were wet as though something had dripped seawater onto them. Others weren't so lucky. A technician named Alvarez swore he kept seeing someone tailing him in the stairwell. He thought it was another crewmate, and finally spun around, flashlight high. He screamed once, sharp and guttural, before tumbling down the steps. We found his body broken, neck twisted at an impossible angle. His eyes were wide open, blood vessels burst as though he had stared at something too long. Ivers didn't have to remind us of the rule. We all felt it in our bones. The danger wasn't in hearing it, but in truly seeing it. From that night on, we lived in half glances. No one dared look over their shoulder for more than a second. No matter what we thought we saw, shadows passed by open doorways. Reflections twitched in portholes, but none of us dared confirm them. Sleep became torture. I woke often with the sensation of breathing against my neck, of fingers brushing the edge of my blanket. Each time I rolled over, forcing myself not to glance fully, I caught only the faintest impression of something retreating, too thin, too long, bending in ways no body should bend. The paranoia grew unbearable. We set watches, pairs of two, so no one was ever alone. But that didn't save O'Malley. He swore something trailed him all the way from the galley to his cabin. His partner confirmed it, a shifting blur always just out of sight. O'Malley cracked, turning suddenly, eyes locking onto it. The scream that followed wasn't human. It was wet, hollow, and it didn't end even after his throat split. By the time we reached him, his eyes were gone, sockets empty as if scooped clean. His body twitched for hours, but his reflection in the steel didn't move at all. After O'Malley, the atmosphere on the rig shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was acceptance, like some of us knew we were already marked. Ivers became quieter, his voice breaking whenever he repeated the rules aloud. He admitted that following them only delayed the inevitable, that something always came for crews who stayed too long. The rules weren't for survival, they were for prolonging the hunt. That thought rooted in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. If the rules only stalled it, what happened when there was nothing left to stall? The answer came during my final patrol. The lights dimmed as they always did, and the footsteps behind me began again. This time closer. I kept walking, my throat dry, repeating the rule in my head. Don't look, don't confirm it. My shadow stretched wrong on the wall, splitting into two, then three, shapes trailing mine. My body screamed to turn, to see, to know. And then the whisper came, inches from my ear, in my own voice. Why are you ignoring me? I froze, my legs trembled as the air thickened, colder than the surrounding steel. Water pooled at my boots, though no pipe had burst. I felt the presence shift, circling, pressing closer. My hand hovered near the wall, steadying myself. I wanted so badly to look, to end the torment of not knowing. My neck strained, every instinct telling me that what followed me wasn't just behind anymore. It was above, below, within the very air I breathed. The silence became unbearable, and then the alarm sounded, shrill and sudden. Not for fire, not for a breach, for ascent. Somehow the rig had initiated an automatic rise, bolts releasing as if unseen hands tore them free. Ivers shouted through the comms, panicked, his words drowned by static. The rig groaned, shuddering upward, and I realized what the final rule meant. The deeper we had gone, the closer it had stayed. But now that we were rising, it was rising with us. Following us up, the walls stretched, the metal screamed, and shadows grew longer than physics allowed. I kept my eyes forward, biting my tongue until I tasted blood, refusing to turn. But the closer we rose toward the surface, the stronger the presence became. It pressed against my skin, breathing with me, moving as I moved. I knew then the rule wasn't just about surviving the trench, it was about surviving the surface. Whatever followed us down here didn't belong above, and yet it was coming. I sit here now, writing this with shaking hands, the walls vibrating as we near shallower waters. The others don't speak anymore. They just stare, wide-eyed, unblinking, at whatever stalks just behind them. I don't dare join them. I can feel it waiting, patient, eager for the first slip of my eyes. The rule repeats in my head like a drumbeat. Never look directly at what follows you up. But what happens when the doors open and daylight floods in? What if it isn't daylight at all? If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.